the great worship we had this morning. I just ask that you just invite your presence in this place, Holy Spirit, and ask that you just speak through Steve. And that you just impart to him the words that we need throughout this week, Lord, and we just thank you for allowing him to come here safely. And just bless us time here. In Jesus' name, amen.
I predict you won't forget his name in the near future.
My name is a little confusing because I have two first names. Actually three if you include my middle name. And it's easier for some people to remember my last name, which is Gregg. My first name is Steve, and I'm not offended if you forget that it's Steve and you call me Gregg. It's happened all my life. And I have the tendency to do the same thing with people who have two first names. I have a friend named Bruce and George. Always wanted to call him George. And I know for some reason when someone has two first names, it's easier to remember the second than the two. So once again, I'm not the least bit bothered if you forget that my name is Steve. I've been teaching for YWAM since 1982. And many of you were not born then, right? At that time, I was about 28 years old or so. And so I was roughly the age of the students I was teaching at YWAM, and now I'm 61 and I'm roughly the age of their parents or grandparents. My children are now older than I was when I began teaching at YWAM. DBS is a fairly new kind of school. I've taught in hundreds of BTSs and SOEs and other programs at YWAM. I've taught a lot of SBSs. I've taught probably half the books of the Bible in SBSs over the years. Been teaching in SBS since about 1984. And now the DBS is a new kind of school that Joe started a few years ago, and I've not taught in very many DBSs because there really haven't been that many. And one of the challenges I'll have is it's a different kind of treatment of the material than I'm accustomed to. As Randy mentioned, I did lead a school in Oregon for 16 years where we taught verse by verse through the whole Bible in 9 months for different students every year. So 16 times going through the Bible verse by verse. Well, we obviously aren't going through verse by verse here. In fact, when I teach for SBSs, it's even difficult because they don't generally expect me to take as much time as I'm accustomed to. So I have to try to be more brief with an SBS when I teach anything there. And now this is an entirely different kind of school, and I have to say it's new for me. And what's more, although I've taught previously in a DBS, I've never taught this material in a DBS. So how this material should be treated in this kind of a school is as new for me as it is for you. In fact, maybe you'd be more familiar than I am with how a DBS covers this much material in so short a time. I understand I'm supposed to kind of go over and just give you the backgrounds and so forth and make applications and so forth, which I do. I mean, that's what I'm accustomed to doing when I teach, but I'm also accustomed to going verse by verse through the whole material, which obviously I'm not even going to approximate this time. So this is experimental for me. If I don't quite get it the way that you're accustomed to it with the other materials, only because I've never done it before, and we'll just see how it goes. I've certainly taught the books of Kings and Chronicles many times, and but in a very different way, different allotment of time, different expectations. So let me start out with just an introduction to the books of Kings, which, as you probably know, run parallel chronologically pretty much with the book of 2nd Chronicles. The books of Kings were originally one book, written by one author, probably, just as is true of the books of Samuel. The books of Samuel, as I'm sure you were told, used to be one book. The same is true of the books of Chronicles. There used to be just one book of Chronicles, which is now two, 1st and 2nd. Now this doesn't mean new material was added, but simply long books were broken into two parts. And the reason this was done is because they were originally written in Hebrew, of course, like the rest of the Old Testament. But the Hebrew doesn't have any vowels in the Hebrew manuscripts, didn't have any vowels. And therefore, they don't take up that much space in writing. In about 285 BC, a group of Alexandrian Jewish scholars in Egypt decided to translate the scriptures into Greek. Now the Greek language, of course, does have vowels, and the words are longer than the Hebrew words. And therefore, translating the Hebrew of the book of Samuel or the book of Kings or the book of Chronicles into Greek meant it was going to be about twice as long. And since scrolls are unwieldy once they get past a certain size, the Septuagint translators, which was this group of Jewish scholars in 285 BC, broke the large books into two sections. So what had been the book of Samuel was now 1st and 2nd Samuel. As you know from studying Samuel, 2nd Samuel just picks up where 1st Samuel left off. And the same is true of the books of Kings and the books of Chronicles. You simply have large books that are broken into two books. Now when this was first done in the Septuagint, they called 1st and 2nd Samuel, they actually called it 1st and 2nd Kingdoms. And then what we call 1st and 2nd Kings, they called 3rd and 4th Kingdom. So what had been one book of Samuel and one book of Kings, the two became four, and they called them 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kingdom in the Septuagint, as they're still found in the Septuagint today. That's not very important for you to know in terms of understanding the books themselves, but that is simply the history of these books. Now, who wrote the books of Kings, or the book of Kings, is not known with any certainty. The Jews have a tradition that it was Jeremiah who wrote most of it. Now, Jeremiah would have had some previous sources of information. He obviously didn't live through the entire period that's covered in Kings. He had historical records. He did live, however, at the time that 2nd Kings comes to an end. 2nd Kings ends, of course, with the deportation of the people of Judah in 586 BC into Babylon. And Jeremiah was alive at that time and witnessed and could easily have reported much of that period. In fact, there's a section of Jeremiah, chapter 52, verses 1 through 34 that is almost identical to 2 Kings 24, 18 through 25-30. In other words, there's a section of 2 Kings that looks almost identical verbatim with Jeremiah, some work of Jeremiah. But before you reach too many conclusions from that, there's also 4 chapters in Isaiah that are almost verbatim, the same as a similar number of chapters in Kings. The chapters about Hezekiah's illness and so forth, and about the siege of Jerusalem at the time of Hezekiah. In any case, there were multiple writers who covered some of this material. And whoever wrote 1st Kings and 2nd Kings, I'm going to assume with the Jews that Jeremiah is the substantial author, though we don't know for sure. He had other books available to him, and we have, for example, a reference in 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 41. It says, "Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did as well as his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon?" So there was a book called the Acts of Solomon. Who wrote it? Who knows? No one knows. We don't have the book anymore. Probably one of Solomon's court, chroniclers wrote up his acts. And the writer of 1 Kings had access to that, and probably that was his main source of information about Solomon's reign. This announcement about this other book comes at the end of 1 Kings' discussion of Solomon's reign, and basically says, I haven't told you everything that is recorded about Solomon's reign. If you want to know more, you can check out the book of the Acts of Solomon, which apparently was still available at the time when this was written. Likewise, throughout the books of Kings, we find allusions of a similar sort to the book of the Kings, to the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, and to the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And basically our author makes reference back to them from time to time in the same way that he made reference to this book of the Acts of Solomon. He basically finishes up talking about a particular king of Judah and says, and the rest of the acts and all he did and so forth are found in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. And when he talks about a king of Israel, the northern kingdom, he often does the same thing. He says the rest of the acts that Ahab, the rest of the acts of Omri, or whatever, are found in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Now, these are books that no longer exist. There are many hundreds, I would imagine, of books that were written in ancient times which don't exist anymore. What's marvelous is that the Bible does, because it's written at a time when most books written did not survive. But because the Bible was revered by Israel, they did copy it. As copies became dilapidated, they made new copies, and so it was preserved for us. But these other books that were used by the authors of the Bible in some cases, apparently were not revered to the same extent and passed from existence. Why weren't they revered? Especially if, as notations and things suggest, those books had more information that is not found in 1 Kings. Why didn't the Jews preserve those books too? Why did they preserve Kings and not the others? In what translation are you using here? Are you using the what is it? The NLT? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't bring mine. When I teach the SPS, they always want me to use the New Revised Standard Version, which is not a favorite of mine. That's why I have become accustomed to bringing it. I'll just to bring the NLT. The New Revised Standard Version that I have has in it the books of the Apocrypha, which the Roman Catholic Bible also contains. And among those books, there are some historical books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are historical records very similar to the books of Kings. They cover a historical narrative about a certain important period of Israel's history. However, most Protestants do not believe that the book of Maccabees belong in the Bible, although they do believe the books of Kings and Samuel belong in the Bible. Why? What's the difference? In both cases, we have, in some cases, elaborate, detailed history of very important events in the life of Israel. Why then would the book of the Kings of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, or the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, or the book of the Acts of Solomon, why would they not be preserved? Why wouldn't many of us put Maccabee in our Bible? They are similar in content. Why do we have Kings and Samuel, but not these others? And the reason is because the books that are in our Bible in the Old Testament are considered to be written by prophets. After all, we say that the Bible is inspired. Well, if you've got something that's written under inspiration, the author had to be inspired. And if the author was inspired, he's what we call a prophet. Many historical works have been written by people who claim no inspiration, and should claim no inspiration because they're not prophets. And therefore, when we read Kings or Samuel, these books, we're reading not merely history that somebody kept meticulous records of. We're reading selected history. We're reading an inspired history. Every historian who writes any kind of history, even about one's own life, if you write your own memoirs, your own autobiography someday, you're not going to put everything in there. You're not going to put the name of your third grade teacher unless something important happened in third grade that's worth keeping. Every historian has to select what will be and what will not be included in their history. And it is understood that Samuel and Kings were written by prophetic, inspired writers, and therefore that the selection of material and the interpretation placed upon the material is from a prophet inspired by God. So that we find, for example, we're told at the end of Kings that when Israel was taken captive into Babylon, this was a judgment that came upon them for all the evil things that Manasseh did. Well, that's somebody's opinion, isn't it? Well, that's God's opinion, because the prophet of God is telling us that. An inspired writer tells us this happened because of what Manasseh did. Now, if we didn't have an inspired writer, we would know that Manasseh did some bad things a few generations before Israel went into captivity. And we would know Israel went into captivity, but we wouldn't be able to be sure that the one was connected to the other. After all, there were several kings after Manasseh. Not all of them were quite as bad. Josiah was not as bad, his grandson. And so you might, if it was not written by a prophet, have somebody saying, I believe they went into captivity because of what Manasseh did. But you'd never know if that's really why it happened or not, because that's just somebody's opinion. That's somebody's editorializing. But when a prophet has written history and they interpret it for you, you're getting God's perspective. you're not just getting the information itself, you're getting a divinely inspired interpretation of what's really going on there. Now, sadly, we might say, we don't have as much information about each of these kings as once was recorded in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And there must have been a lot more information available, but the inspired writers who had access to those books did not see fit to preserve it. Because, like every historian, the writer, probably Jeremiah of Kings, inspired by God, realized that the things he's going to include are the things that tell us something about God's purposes and God's dealings. And there's an awful lot of peripheral, less important details that if they had been included, everything would have been kind of diluted with it. Now, the books of Kings cover the history of Israel from the death of David to the death of the nation. You know, in Samuel, we see the birth of the nation and the glorious reign of David. You see in Samuel begins with the end of the period of the judges, with Eli and his sons, and then there's this prophet that God raised up named Samuel, and he's a kingmaker, and he is guiding the nation through the transition from the period of the judges to the period of the kings. And that was really the request of the people, not God, that God had set up the period of the judges, but the people said to Samuel, give us a king who rules like all the other nations have. And Samuel was displeased by this. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and he went and prayed, and God said, don't feel bad, Samuel. These people are not rejecting you, they're rejecting me, that I should not reign over them. So we see that in 1 Samuel 8, there was a transition made at the request of the people, but God saw it as a rejection of him as their king. In fact, later on in the book of Hosea, God refers back to that. He says, I gave them a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath, referring to Saul. Saul was the first king that was appointed. Interesting that his name means asked for. And so God gave them the king they asked for, and his name means asked for. And he was a humble king at first, but obviously went bad, and he was rejected, and God sought another man, a man after his own heart, in David. And David's reign becomes the focus of course, the second book of Kings. We find at the end of, second book of Samuel. At the end of 1 Samuel, we have the death of Saul. At the beginning of 2 Samuel, we have the report of the death of Saul to David, and then the people of Judah come to make David king for 7 years, and then the people of Israel accept him as their king for 33 and a half more years. And so we have a 40-year reign of David. His reign ends at his death in the beginning of 1 Kings. So David, actually the most wonderful king, not the most wonderful person in the Bible, but the most wonderful king that Israel had, the one who took Israel from being a small tribal league, humiliated under the oppression of the Philistines throughout the reign of Saul. Even Saul was killed by the Philistines. David conquered the Philistines. He started that out when he was a little boy, killed one of them, killed the champion of them. But then throughout much of his early reign, he was putting down the Philistines who had oppressed Israel through much of the period, even of the judges, even in Samson's day. It was the Philistines that were giving him so much trouble. So from the time of Samson through the reign of Saul into the reign of David, the Philistines had been, oppressors of Israel. David dispensed with the Philistines once and for all. Solomon never had to deal with it at all. And David didn't stop there. He went and he conquered all the lands around him, brought them under tribute. And so Israel in the days of David, just before he died, was at its most powerful, most glorious, most wealthy stage that it had been at, and that it would ever be out again probably, if not for a slight uptick in the days of Solomon, which was lost finally after Solomon's time. But David dies at the beginning of 1 Kings, and the nation dies at the end of 2 Kings. So the books of Kings cover the whole period from the death of the great King David to the death of the nation itself, which, although of course it did recover somewhat, I suppose you know, although the material study I guess haven't gone that far, but of course this ends with the Jews being taken into Babylon, but after a captivity of 70 years there, they returned from Babylon, but not all of them. Only about 50,000 returned with the man named Zerubbabel A few more came back later with the man named Ezra, and a few more with the man named Nehemiah. But from the time that Kings ends and the Jews go into Babylon, the majority of Israelites are never again in Israel. There has never been a time since the end of the book of Kings that the majority of Jews live in the Promised Land, even to this day. Many times people say, well, today we're seeing a great regathering of the Jews to Israel. Maybe we are, maybe not. There are as many Jews leaving as coming every given year, and the vast majority of Jews still live outside of Israel. There are more Jews in America than there are in Israel. And most of them in New York City. There's still a lot of Jews all over the world, and that's been the case since the days that are recorded for us at the end of 2 Kings. A remnant did return after the Babylonian exile, but it was never more than a remnant that came back to the land. So from the death of David to the death of the nation. The death of the nation took place in three essential stages. The first, of course, is with the splitting of the nation. After Solomon's death in 1 12, in the days of Rehoboam, the nation split into two. The house of David under Rehoboam retained only two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Benjamin is an extremely small tribe. It was actually adjacent to the territory of Judah. And actually Jerusalem lay within Benjamin's borders. So Judah and Benjamin together, with Jerusalem as the capital, remained the southern kingdom. The other 10 tribes to the north seceded, picked their own king, Jeroboam, and continued for a period of 209 years before they were wiped out and disappeared completely. But the beginning of the deterioration of the nation happened immediately upon Solomon's death. And that is first stage through Rehoboam's stupidity, causing the nation to divide into two, which was very bad, obviously, for the country. And then the next stage was when the northern 10 tribes succumbed to Assyria in 722 BC. And they disappeared. What happened is the Assyrians, whenever they conquered a region, certainly the northern kingdom of Israel was not the only region they conquered all the regions around there. And when Assyria would conquer a people, the king would deport the local people and resettle them in areas that he conquered from other nations. And he'd bring in to that area people he had conquered from other nations and settle them in there. Now what's the point of that? The Assyrians were the first people to do that as a strategy, but it's a really brilliant strategy because whenever a kingdom would expand and conquer surrounding kingdoms and rule it, there was always that bit of nationalism for the mother country among those who were subjected to the suzerain. And therefore there was always the chance that the people under subjection might revolt and say, we want to claim our independence again. This is what's going on in Israel today with the Palestinians. Palestinians felt they were an independent people. And when the nation of Israel became the nation of Israel, they were marginalized. But they're still in Palestine still. And they're trying to rise up and overthrow Israel. And that's kind of how it is with nations that get conquered and subjugated to other nations. If they're in their homeland, they're patriotic. But you move them out and move the people of the northern 10 tribes into Syria or into Persia or into Edom, something like that, and they have no loyalty to those regions. That's not their homeland, and it kind of demoralizes them. It really just prevents there from being any uprisings. And the Assyrians were the first to do this. And what happened when, in 722 BC, when Assyria conquered the northern kingdom's capital, Samaria, deported most of the people out and brought in different people. And the 10 tribes ended up just intermarrying with people from other nations so that there aren't any 10 tribes anymore, anywhere. At least history knows of none. There are people who think they migrated to the British Isles, and that the British are the descendants of the 10 tribes, and there are other goofy theories like that. I think that's a goofy theory, but there are people who hold to it. There are people still trying to identify where those 10 tribes are, and in many cases they're trying to say they are them. But history knows of no such thing. History only knows that they were defeated, they were dispersed. As far as anyone knows, they all intermarried. Their tribal distinctiveness simply vanished. And that left only the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. Of course, there were people from the other 10 tribes in Judah by this time, because after the split into 2 nations, King Jeroboam in the north did things that offended a lot of the Jews, or the Israelites, under his reign. He first offended the Levites, because he set up people to be priests at his shrines who weren't Levites. And therefore, the Levites really only had special status at the temple in Jerusalem, which was in the southern kingdom. So many of the Levites simply migrated down to the south and became part of the kingdom of Judah. Probably the majority of them did. So that, the northern kingdom lost most of their Levites. But there were not only the Levites, there were others of other tribes, of those 10 tribes, who realized that setting up golden calves wasn't exactly a good idea if you want to avoid the wrath of Yahweh. And so they found their way south also, and they also migrated, so that shortly after the split, there were now not only the tribe of Judah and Benjamin in the south, but there were individuals from all the tribes that had moved back down. So you still had 12, representatives of the 12 tribes, even in the days of the New Testament, when James addresses his epistle to the 12 tribes who were scattered abroad, greeting. Well, they were 12 tribes because some of the 10 tribes had become part of the nation of Judah. So by the time that the northern kingdom fell and the 10 tribes as a consolidated nation ceased to exist, there was still a remnant, a few from all the tribes that still survived in the surviving nation of Judah. And you might remember that the Assyrians later came down to Judah and attempted to do the same thing there that they had done in Israel. And they besieged Jerusalem, but they underestimated what God could do for a king who would trust him. And Judah was fortunate at that time to have a king who trusted God, because they didn't have many who did. But Hezekiah was the king at the time, and he petitioned God, and God sent an angel out at night and killed 185,000 of the besieging Assyrians outside of Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem was spared and did not fall. Only the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians. Judah was spared and did not fall for another 100 and some odd years. So the fall of the nation, the death of the nation, took place in stages. You had the splitting of the nation in the day of Rehoboam. You had the destruction of the northern kingdom, which was the end of the majority of the Jewish people, the Israeli people, being a nation in 722. And then, of course, because the southern kingdom, although it lasted longer because they had a few good kings, once in a while they had a good king, but they had pretty bad kings for the most part also. And they turned. In fact, Hezekiah was a great king, but his son Manasseh was the worst king Judah ever had. He introduced all kinds of idolatry and paganism into Judah, and his reign was the longest of any of the kings of Judah. He reigned 55 years, and he's said to be the very worst king they ever had. And because of what Manasseh, Hezekiah's son, did, Judah also came under judgment. Not in his day, though. But you see, the problems that Manasseh brought in were endemic. They became, the culture that continued after his death in the next several kings. Actually, according to the books of Chronicles, Manasseh actually repented. We don't read about it in Kings, but in Chronicles, he was taken away captive into Babylon by the Assyrians somehow. And when he was in captivity, he repented, and God restored him back, and he came and brought reforms, like his grandson Josiah would do of a sort. And yet it is too little too late. People were already addicted to idolatry. And that's why Josiah's reforms 2 generations later didn't help either. I mean, Josiah was a really good king in Judah, and his reforms no doubt stalled the coming of judgment on Judah as well. But it was, again, too shallow, too passing. And when Josiah passed, the nation didn't follow God anymore. All the rest of the kings was wicked. And so God brought an end to Judah. Now the Assyrians were gone. The Assyrians didn't conquer Judah, and in fact they weren't even in power anymore at the time that Judah fell. The Assyrians had been conquered by the Babylonians by this time, in Jeremiah's day. And it was the Babylonians that came and took away the people of Judah into captivity. And that's how the book of Kings, 2 Kings, ends. Okay? And so the death of the nation happened in three important stages: the division of the nation, the fall of the northern kingdom, and the fall of the southern kingdom. The division took place in the year 931 BC. The fall of the northern kingdom in 722 BC, and the fall of the southern kingdom in 586 BC. Now, what is the purpose of the book of Kings? Why was it written? I mentioned there are other historical books written at the time that haven't survived. The Jews didn't preserve them. They're just historical chronicles, and they would have been very interesting to a person interested in history like me. I would like to read them, but they're not going to be found, I don't think. We'll never see them. But why was this book written? And I believe it was to teach that God was in charge of Israel's destiny through the covenant relationship he had with them. You see, a book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah might not mention this. It might just mention what the kings did and what happened to them. But the book of Kings continually shows where God is angry at his people for violating his covenant. And God is instructing them. God is sending prophets. The books of Kings reveal an important role played by the prophets. Now, Samuel had been a prophet. In fact, Samuel, the Jews consider that Samuel was the first of the prophets, although there were prophets before him. But he was the first of the, theocratic prophets. He's the first prophet of the kingdom because he was the prophet that inaugurated the kingdom. He ordained Saul to be king and David to be king. And so Samuel was the first prophet of the kingdom. But after Solomon, well, even in the days of David, even before Solomon, you've got Nathan is an important prophet who rebukes David. There's Gad is another one. And these guys wrote books too, by the way. Second Chronicles, I think it's 29 mentions books written by the prophet Gad and the prophet Nathan, which apparently also provided some of the sources for the writing of the book of Chronicles. But these prophets, a lot of them were priests, you'll find. It was often the case that a man who already held office as a priest, God would simply put his spirit upon him and he'd become a prophet to the nation. This was true of Jeremiah. This was true of Zechariah, the prophet who wrote the book of Zechariah, son of Berechiah. It was also true of Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. It was also true of John, the son of Zechariah, who we call the Baptist. These were men who were priests from priestly line, who were called to a more particular office of prophecy, to speak the oracles of God. In other words, Israel didn't only have their political machine moving through the ages. They had God's spokesmen, inspired spokesmen, who were sent to rebuke them, to commend them, to direct them, to interpret what is going on to them. And two of the prophets that were most significant are very prominent in the book of Kings. And those are, of course, Elijah and Elisha. Now together, Elijah and Elisha occupy 20 chapters of the books of Kings. Elijah is prominent in 1 Kings, and he's taken up into heaven at the very beginning of 2 Kings. So the career of Elijah is from about chapter 16 to 15, we have Elijah showing up. Anyway, after he leaves, Elisha, and Elisha is dominant in the scene in 2 Kings. These two prophets were very unusual in that they not only prophesied, but they worked miracles. They rose at the time when the nation in the north was in real crisis. These were not prophets to Judah, they were prophets to the northern kingdom. Which shows that when the Pharisees rebuked Nicodemus in John chapter 7, and they said, "Search and look, for no prophet arises out of Galilee." they weren't quite right, because the northern kingdom is what was later Galilee, and there were a lot of prophets that arose out of Galilee. Hosea was one of them. Elijah and Elisha were one of them. Jonah was from Galilee. It wasn't called Galilee in those days, but it was the same region. And Elijah and Elisha were so important that in later Israelite thinking, Elijah was considered the prince of the prophets, so neither he nor Elisha wrote any books. We have in our Bible the works of the writing prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, those guys, four minor prophets. But in addition to the writing prophets, there are prophets who didn't write, as far as we know, anything. Didn't write any books for preservation anyway. And Elijah and Elisha were not so much the writing kind of prophets, but the action kind of prophets. They demonstrated their authority by their actions. Now, prophets who wrote usually were given the ability to tell the future, and a later generation that would see their prophecies fulfilled would know, oh, they were really prophets because they told the future that came true. Elijah and Elisha could do that too, but they mainly had something else going for them to prove they were really from God, and that is signs and wonders. And Elijah had, an abundance of miracles that he wrought. And Elisha had even more. Now, sometimes when we read the Old Testament, we think, wow, in the Old Testament times, God was just always doing miracles. I wonder why we don't see quite as many now. And I realize there's a lot of Christians who believe we should see exactly as many now as they saw back then. But as you study the Old Testament, you need to get some perspective on this. There are a lot of miracles recorded in the Old Testament, but the vast majority of them occur in clusters of two very short periods of time. One is the Exodus, where you've got the miraculous plagues of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, you've got the manna, you've got, the parting of the Jordan, you've got all kinds of miracles during the time of Moses, and also Joshua, his successor. So over a period of maybe possibly 50 years, maybe a little more, you do see a lot of miracles in the time of the Exodus and the conquest of the land of Canaan. Then, the next time you really see a lot of miracles are in the ministries of Elijah and Elisha. And there are hundreds of years in between. There's like 380 or something years of the period of Judges. And you don't see much in the way of miracles then. Essentially, God did miracles in large numbers on special occasions. Of course, the next time after the time of Elijah and Elisha, you see a lot of miracles is the ministry of Jesus and the apostles. So these are like epics. These are like times when God is doing what he doesn't usually do, and that is a lot of miracles. At the time of the Exodus, when he established the nation of Israel. At the time of Elijah and Elisha, when he was about ready to dump the northern kingdom. And at the time of Jesus and the apostles, when he was establishing the new covenant and the church. Apart from that, we find the occasional miracle in the Bible, but nothing like what you find in the time of Elijah and Elisha. Very unusual to see that many miracles done through people. And it seems clear that God was doing an unusual thing in the ministry of these two prophets, because they came at the time when Ahab and Jezebel were reigning in the northern kingdom. And that was the time, very possibly, arguably the very worst time in the northern kingdom's history, spiritually speaking. You not only have Elijah and Elisha, you have other prophets that God brought. There's a prophet named Ahijah. There's a prophet named Jehu, who's not to be confused with the king Jehu. There's a prophet named Micaiah, who we hear from at the end of 1 Kings, chapter 22, with the rebukes Ahab. We have Jonah, of course, and Isaiah. We have 4 unnamed prophets. There's a prophetess, a female named Huldah, and 100 prophets hidden in caves by a man named Obadiah, who snuck them food to keep them from being killed by Jezebel. There's also, in the days of Elijah, sons of the prophets in certain clusters in Bethel and Jericho and Gilgal. These sons of the prophets, sometimes we refer to them as the prophetic schools or guilds. These were actually established by Samuel, who was the first leader of these schools, the prophets. And we read about Samuel making a circuit among these different towns to encourage or teach or do whatever it was he did with these prophetic groups. They called them the sons of the prophets. But we see them also emerging prominently in the time of Elijah's departure, because Elijah is also going around to these different prophetic guilds, and they're aware that he's leaving, and they say so. So we see the ministry of the prophet was really prominent. We have the two great non-writing prophets, but during the same period of time, we have a great number of writing prophets. And all the prophets that wrote in our Bible, with the exception of the post-exilic prophets, Ezekiel and Daniel and Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, all the other prophets are from this period of time called, that's covered in the Kings. All right, so this is some of the background of these books and some of the significance. Let's talk about an outline of the book, and we're going to talk about Solomon's reign somewhat today. The book of 1 Kings divides just about in half in a very natural way. The book of 1 Kings has 22 chapters, and it's divided into 11 chapters and 11 chapters. The first 11 chapters are about begin with Solomon succeeding his father David to the throne, and cover the reign of Solomon and the various features that are underscored there. His wealth, his wisdom, his fame, his compromises, his downfall, really, because he departed from the Lord. But the first 11 chapters are about Solomon's reign. That was a 40-year period, just like David before him, and just like Saul before him. Each of these first three kings reigned for 40 years. You know, and they, of course, came right after the period of the Judges. And as you know from reading the Judges, most of the Judges judged Israel for 40 years, except I think Gideon did it for 80 years. But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, because it's not like there was a term when you become judge, you get to judge for 40 years, and then you have to step down. Each of these judges judged. It just happened to be 40 years in each case. You know, after several of those generations, if you were the judge, you might begin to look at your watch and say, okay, I've been here for 38 years. Am I going to die 2 years from now? Because that was the pattern. Not only did the judges mostly judge for 40 years, but the first king Saul reigned for 40 years and died. David reigned for 40 years and died. Solomon reigned for 40 years and died. After that, there were no more 40-year kings. But there were no more kings that moved over the United Nations of Israel either. Because it split right after Solomon's death. So the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings cover Solomon's reign 40 years. The remaining 11 chapters of 1 Kings cover the reign, the first approximately 80 years of the divided kingdom. So from Rehoboam's mistake and the splitting of the nation to Ahab's reign, really, because by the time 1 Kings ends, Ahab is reigning, and he's still reigning at the end there, and so is Jehoshaphat in the south. The northern kingdom had 8 kings in that 80 years. The southern kingdom had 4 in that 80 years. Now, when you take both 1st and 2nd Kings together, you find that the northern kingdom had 19 kings. Some of them reigned for only a really, really short time. One reigned for only a week. But there were 19 of them in the north. In the south, there were 20 of them. But the southern kingdom lasted about half again as long in terms of years as the northern kingdom did. So the northern kingdom only lasted 2/3 as long as the southern kingdom did, and yet they only had 1 king less than the southern kingdom had, because kings of the southern kingdom often reigned longer, Fortunately, the first 4 kings in the southern kingdom, which is, of course, the period covered in the first Kings in the last 11 chapters, those kings included 2 good ones. Now, Rehoboam and Abijam were not very good. Together, Rehoboam and Abijam, his son, in the south reigned 20 years. But the rest of that 60 years were the reign of Asa and Jehoshaphat. And they were good kings. So, of the 80 years, 3/4 of it, the southern kingdom had good kings reigning. The northern kingdom had 8 kings in that same period of time. Twice as many, and not a good one of the bunch. In fact, if you can go to all 19 of the kings of the north kingdom, in their entire history they didn't have a good one. Not one good one of the bunch. It's interesting that the kings of the south, that is of Judah, were always measured by the standard of David himself. A good king would say he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, or his heart was perfect before the Lord, like his father, meaning his ancestor, David. And when a king was bad in Judah, it was said his heart was not perfect for the Lord like David had been. David was the standard by which all the kings of Judah were measured, either favorably or unfavorably. Now in the north, all the kings were measured by their first king, Jeroboam. And they were all bad. And so again and again, after we have reference to a new king rising in the northern kingdom of Israel, we say he did evil in the sight, and he continued in the ways of Jeroboam, who caused Israel to sin. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. So all the kings of the north were like Jeroboam. Some of the kings of the south were like David, but not most of them. In any case, there were enough good kings in the south that it had its occasional revival, which allowed at least for the judgment to be stalled and for the kingdom in the south to last considerably longer. But in 1 Kings, we only get up to the king Ahab in the north and Jehoshaphat in the south. And that's how things stand when 1 Kings ends and 2 Kings comes up. Now, 2 Kings, of course, has the rest of that. And we've talked about much of the rest of that already, so there's not much to say about it. But when we look at 2 Kings, we can see it divides into 3 main sections. The first 10 chapters are very much obsessed with Elisha the prophet. You almost forget about who's reigning during those times. Those 10 chapters, it's almost like who's the king is not even interesting. You've got Elisha the prophet in the northern kingdom, and he's doing very interesting things. And so the whole first 10 chapters of 2 Kings is about Elisha the prophet. But he dies in chapter 13, but after chapter 10, he's not the focal point anymore. The first 10 chapters are pretty much the focal point, but it's not until chapter 13 that he actually dies. But from chapter 11 to chapter 17 of 2 Kings, we have kind of a remainder of the history of the northern kingdom, intermixed with, alternating between the kings of the north and the kings of the south. You know how this is done. You've already read this book, right? That's not very good. Testing. Still works. So, you know how it does this. It does this basically in 1 Kings and 2 Kings. When it's focused on following the parallel history of the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel, it goes back and forth. It talks about who became king in Judah and what year it was of the reigning king in Israel. And then he'll take it usually to his death. And then if there's been a new king in Israel during the time of his reign, it'll switch over and say, now in the such and such year, that the reign of this king in Judah, this guy became king in Israel. And it sometimes just goes back and forth. That's what 2 Kings chapters 11 through 17 do. So that's the second section of 2 Kings. You've got the first 10 chapters about Elisha. The next chapters, the next 7 chapters are about the alternating kings in the south and north up until the fall of Israel to the Samaria, the false Samaria to the Assyrians. So we have the end of the northern kingdom in chapter 17. Then from chapter 18 to the end of the book, chapter 25, is of course the remaining history of Judah. Because there's no more northern kingdom to interact with, you can't go back and forth anymore. They disappear in chapter 17. So from chapters 18 through 25, you have the remaining history of the tribe of Judah, or the nation of Judah, until they're carried away into battle. So this is how these books are outlined. Okay? Now, I think you get a break at 10:30, don't you? Okay. So I've got to decide what I want to do between now and 10:30 because I don't want to get too deeply into anything new.
Could you just give a little, I don't know if I missed it or if you didn't finish, why written?
Why it was written? Oh, yes. I started
somewhere. I think you got.
Started to talk about that.
Steve, you can break whenever you want. We're going to be doing our own.
You don't have a hard break? Okay. All right. Here's what I have down as the purpose of the books of Kings. To teach that Israel's national fortunes are directly tied to their loyalty or disloyalty to the covenant under which they came to being. Say that again? To teach that Israel's national fortunes, that means whether things go well or bad, are directly tied to their loyalty or disloyalty to the covenant under which they came into being. But that's not all. And to demonstrate the sovereign providence of God in raising up and bringing down rulers. That's what I believe is the purpose. You see, if America were to fall, let us say, before the next election, let's just say things deteriorate, there's a huge Ebola pandemic, like the Black Plague in Europe, or ISIS takes control of chemical weapons in Iraq, which they apparently now have access to, and they start doing terrorist bombings in all major cities of America with these chemical weapons that wipe out whole populations. The president declares martial law so there won't be another election. Suddenly the constitutional government of the United States is over. It's pandemonium, comes under Islamic control, whatever, something happens. One of these realistic scenarios. If that would happen, the history books would record the facts of that. The history of America would be a very interesting history. But there would be some who strongly suspect that this happened to America because it forgot God. That it was a nation that was founded on reverence for God and His ways, but which thumbed her nose at God, especially in the latter decades before her downfall. Who decided that God wasn't real or important anymore, and that whatever was politically correct is really what we should be embracing as our religious norm, and therefore went the way of all nations that have forgotten God, like Israel did, or Judah did. Now the point here is, you could look at the entire history of America from beginning to end through entirely secular eyes. People who don't believe in God would know the history of America just as much as people did believe in God. They could read the history. They would know that religion had at one time played a big role in America, but that it ceased to later. But they might not make the connection. They might just think that's incidental. They might think that they might describe the fall of America in terms of bad leadership decisions of another sort, economic or something like that. But you see, the book of Kings was written to prevent anyone from making that mistaken assessment of the history of Israel. It is not a secular history. It is a history of a covenant nation. They came into existence because God made a covenant with a group of escaped slaves from Egypt, Mount Sinai. And he said, if you will obey my covenant and obey my voice indeed, then you'll be the chief of the nations. I'll make you the head over the nations and not the tail. I will, you'll be wealthy. I'll protect you from your enemies. It will go very well for you. You're your own special people, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. So that was the covenant. God said, you keep my words, you keep my covenants, and you'll have all of that. You'll be the greatest nation in the whole world. But, of course, it's very evident that they didn't keep the covenant, and they came to an end. Now, is that significant? A secularist might not think so. The secularist might think that's just an interesting fact of their history. But a prophet of God, writing a book like Kings, would be writing to make that direct connection. These people, this king, did not honor the Lord. His heart was not perfect toward the Lord as was his father David. This man, this king was a wicked king because he continued in the sins. Not the administrative ineptitude, but the sins of Jeroboam, who caused Israel to sin. And so the book of Kings shows that Israel's fortunes are directly related to whether they're keeping God's covenant or not. And although you don't see immediate results always, for example, Manasseh was a very wicked king who reigned apparently prosperously for 55 years, yet it was because of what he did that Judah fell a few generations later. Remember in Ecclesiastes, Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes 8:11, he said, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the hearts of the sons of men are fully set in them to do evil. Because God doesn't judge instantly. People think they got away with it, so they just keep doing it. Well, that's what happens. God does judge, but not instantly. It's not an instant karma manifestation. It deteriorates, and God sends prophets to warn. And that's what the prophets were there for. They were there to warn the people that this is what God was doing and what God would do if they didn't repent.
Is that Joseph's son, Manasseh?
No, that's a different Manasseh. Okay. Joseph's son Manasseh was the founder of the half-tribe of Manasseh. The Manasseh we're talking about now was actually the son of Hezekiah, one of the kings of Judah, and the very worst of them. But this was, of course, hundreds of years after the time of Joseph's, actually, probably thousands of years after. So we're talking the same name, different person. Yeah. So we see in this book something we might wish we could have in a book of American history. A prophet's eye view. What a prophet, what God sees going on in America and what's taking place. Of course, even if we had that, we probably wouldn't fare any better because we don't, Americans don't listen to God any more than Jews do. People just don't like to listen to God. If he's saying something unflattering, or what they don't want to hear. But you can see then that prophets in these books like Elijah and Elisha play as much a role in the fate of the nation as the kings do. And the prophets don't hold a political office. They're just wandering around the desert or from city to city, doing what they do. And yet, it's very clear that the book of Kings considers that Elijah is significant enough to have 7 chapters about it. And that Elisha is significant enough to have 10 chapters about it. In a total of 47 chapters, these guys have almost half, or 2/5 of the materials about the prophets themselves, because it's a religious history. It's a spiritualist, and everything is told us through the eyes of somebody who's attuned to how God is seeing things and what God's doing. So that's a different kind of history. than we have in other books. Except other books of the Bible, we do have that kind of history book. All right, why don't we take a break? It's 20 after 10. Radio program. For many years, I've been doing a daily live radio program. And for several years, it's been twice a day. In 1997, I started an afternoon program that's every weekday, an hour. And it's on radio stations in various parts of the United States. And it's live, and people phone in and they ask Bible questions. And so I try to answer them on the air. Well, a few years ago, I added another radio show every day, so I do it twice a day now. And that's in the morning. Now, where I live in California, that's from 9:30 to 10 in the morning, but here it's 6:30 to 7 in the morning. So I need to, if I can, do the show from here in the mornings from 6:30 to 7. Now, I may be in this room doing it if I can't get a good internet connection from my room. I can do the show from my room, but I have to hook up through the internet to the radio station back in California. So, like Randy said, if you happen to see me here with headphones on, and between 6:30 and 7, that's what I'm doing, and it'd be great if you could keep it quiet. I was down here this morning, but no one was here. It's not a problem. But, and then we had a problem at the other end at the radio station in California, so we were able to do it quite right anyway. But probably the next 4 days, I'll be doing the show live. It may well be I'll be in this room from 6:30 to 7. So if you happen to have business in this room, come in to do it, but just realize that if you're not very quiet, you might be on the radio for thousands of people to hear whatever it is you're doing. All right. Thank you. Oh, and about the Q&A, the question and answer time. That's actually what I do on the radio every day. A half hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon every day, just taking questions about the Bible. Been doing it for 17 years or more, and on a daily basis. So I'm acquainted pretty much with all the questions in the whole world. That doesn't mean I can answer them. I'm just acquainted with the questions. May not be acquainted with the answers. But on Wednesday night, I guess it is, that's when we're going to just have a time for you and others coming in. If you have any questions about the Bible or about Christianity, you're welcome to ask them. Now, you say, well, how can you invite people to ask any question? You know, you think you know everything? Actually, I don't. I don't know everything, but I don't mind saying I don't know. So it's easy. People say, is it scary getting on the radio and just telling people ask any question? And there's thousands of people around the United States who can call in. Not scary at all. Because if I don't know the answer, I just say I don't know. Yeah, there's lots of times I have to say I don't know. But lots of the things that you don't know might be known and knowable, and it may be that I can help answer some of the questions that you're wondering about. All right? Well, let's look at the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings. And I have to apologize, I thought you had read 1 Kings before I got here. So I was assuming you knew a lot of things that I was alluding to. And it turns out that many of you haven't read 1 Kings before, or not recently, and so maybe you didn't. I think from this point on in the lectures, it'll be easier after you've read some of the 1 Kings. When I get here tomorrow, you'll have some of this under your belt more. But, that being so, let's look at 1 Kings chapter 1. And when this book opens, David is not yet dead, but he's going to be very soon. The book of Kings does not tell us, as 1 Chronicles does, that David made a lot of preparations for the temple. You remember that David had wanted to build a temple, and God said to him, actually this is in Chronicles also, you're a man of war. Your hands have shed blood. I'm not going to let you be the one to build the temple. But your son, who will be a man of peace, will build the temple. And so David, although he was not really permitted to have anything to do with the construction, he did receive plans by inspiration, apparently. He claimed that God showed him a plan for the temple. He drew it up. And when he died, he left it to Solomon. Kings doesn't tell us about this, but Chronicles does. And David also took a collection, free will offering from the people, as well as making arrangements with his friend, who was the king of Tyre, Hiram, to provide for wood and things like that. And so by the time that David died, there had been immense preparations made for the building of the temple, but David had not really been able to do any of the work. And so we find David on his deathbed, really, as we come to chapter 1. And it says, King David was old and advanced in years, and although they covered him with clothes, he could not get warm. So his servants said to him, "Let a young virgin be sought for my lord the king, and let her wait on the king, and be his attendant. Let her lie in your bosom, so that my lord the king may be warm." So they searched for a beautiful girl throughout all the territory of Israel, and found Abishag the Shunammite, and brought her to the king. The girl was very beautiful. She became the king's attendant and served him, but the king did not have sex with her. So this was simply, probably as a shepherd when David was young, and he was out with the flock at night, he probably, when it's really cold, would bed down with a good sheepdog or a sheep to stay warm. But he didn't have sheep in the palace, nor sheepdogs. And so the girl would serve a better purpose. Most men would prefer that anyway. But he was not sexually aroused by her. He had plenty of sex in his life. He had 8 wives, a lot of sons. He was now 70 years old. And, you can have old, you can, well, I don't know, everyone here besides me is old, but you can get a place where you can take it or leave it. But if you're freezing cold and you're shivering and your body doesn't generate any warmth because you're sick, you're not really thinking about sex anyway. And they just decided to find a girl to lay in bed with her. What a strange solution then. They didn't have electric blankets back then, or even hot water bottles. So that's what you do. You find a hot girl and let her lie down next to the king. So David didn't object to that. And so they found this girl whose name was Abishag, the Shunammite. I said Shunammite by accident because that's what we read about the girl in the book Song of Solomon. Solomon's beloved was called a Shulamite. We don't know her name, but she's referred to as the Shulamite. This girl's a Shunammite, and some scholars think it's no different, that a Shulamite and Shunammite are the same thing. We don't know. It's a possibility that this beautiful young girl that kept David warm became actually Solomon, one of Solomon's wives, and that he may have written Song of Solomon about it. Maybe not. But you know that later on, Adonijah, one of the sons of David, asks for this girl in marriage, and Solomon kills her. Now, this would mean something to us if we felt like Solomon was in love with this girl, and he didn't like one of his brothers, trying to muscle in. But there's more to it than that, because a girl who had lain with the king would be technically considered one of his concubines, whether he'd had sex with her or not. I mean, it certainly would not be appropriate for a girl who had this kind of role to keep the king warm to have a husband outside that she went home to at the time. I mean, no man's wife would be, entrusted in this kind of situation, be improper. And therefore, she, by coming into David's harem like this, became technically like a concubine. Now, you will find, if you didn't already know, that in the Middle East, one of the ways that a person, a new king, would establish himself in the public eye as the new king and an authority would be that he would take the wives and concubines of the former king and sleep with them. When Absalom tried to take over David's kingdom, the first thing he did, he took 10 of David's concubines, and out in public, he slept with them all. And that was just his way of saying, see, I'm where my dad used to be. I guess the assumption was, if my dad was still in power, he'd never allow me to do this. Right? So I'm the power
So
now.
that wasn't that like a sin against God?
Yeah, that was a sin. Yeah, well, I should say this. It was a sin what Absalom did, because he was rebelling against his dad.
I mean, just overall, like kings having multiple wives.
Having multiple wives and husbands. The Bible doesn't really comment on it, except that in Deuteronomy 17, it said that the kings of Israel should not multiply to themselves wives. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they were to be strictly monogamous. Abraham wasn't, and Jacob wasn't, and Moses wasn't. I mean, a lot of the heroes in Israel had more than one wife, as well as a lot of the villains had more than one wife. The Bible doesn't generally comment on polygamy as far as it being itself a sin, and that's strange to us. It's strange to us because we're Westerners, and because we're modern, and we live in an age where women's rights are as important as men's rights. In the Middle East, in ancient times, that was not really so much the case. In other parts of the world sometimes too. God didn't forbid polygamy, and that surprises us. Because in the whole law, there's nothing that forbids polygamy. But it doesn't necessarily sponsor it either. It's almost like polygamy was just one of those things in society that people sometimes did, and God never spoke up against it. And we would think that he should, because to us, it would seem like adultery. Like, if a man had two wives, he's committing adultery against one of them with the other one, right? But that just wasn't the mentality in the Old Testament. Now, in the New Testament, we have a higher standard of understanding of marriage in the New Testament. And it's based on Christ and the church. Paul said in Ephesians chapter 5, that the husband must love his wife as Christ loves the church. The wife must submit to her husband as the church submits to Christ. It says because it's written in Genesis 2:24, Paul quotes it in Ephesians 5. For this cause, a man shall leave his father and mother, shall cleave to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. And Paul quoting it says, this is a great mystery, but it speaks of Christ and the church. So in the New Testament, we find that marriage is something more sacred than it was known to be in the Old Testament. Not that it wasn't sacred, it was a very sacred thing. If you slept with another man's wife, you'd be put to death. But if you slept with your own wife, no matter how many wives there were, that was not adultery, because to the mind of ancient people, not only Jews, but ancient people in general, adultery was when you slept with somebody else's wife. If you had 10 wives or 20 wives or 1,000 wives like Solomon, that wasn't considered adultery because none of them were someone else's wife. And so the man was not committing adultery. Now you say that doesn't put the woman's interest at the same level as the man's interest. No, unfortunately it doesn't. Fortunately, we're more enlightened now. We realize that the women's interest should be on the same level. Paul said that too. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7 that he says the wife does not have power over her own body, but the husband does. And the husband doesn't have power over his own body, but his wife does. In other words, just as in the Old Testament, a man had absolute access to his wife, but his wife didn't have absolute access to him. She might share him with other wives. But Paul says, but now we understand that the husband's body belongs to the wife, in the same way that the wife's body belongs to the husband. That is to say, if it's wrong for a woman to have multiple husbands, it would also be wrong for a man to have multiple wives. That's what the New Testament teaches. When Paul is talking about the qualifications for elders of the church, both in 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus chapter 1, both places it says an elder has to be a husband of one wife. Apparently there were still polygamists around in the days when Paul wrote, but they couldn't be in the eldership. But eventually polygamy just died out completely as practiced in Christian lands, because there was a higher view of marriage, a higher view of wives' rights. Remember, the husband is told to cherish his wife like Christ cherishes the church. Christ only has one church, only one bride. And so that understanding eventually raised people's sensitivities to the fact that the wife really, she's got as much right to her husband as the husband has to his wife. And that means that just like a wife well, like a man would not share his wife with other men. So a wife should not share her husband with other women. But that was a understanding that was slow in developing, and it came into in the New Testament time. In the Old Testament time, marriage was viewed kind of differently. It wasn't the same thing as in the New Testament where it's, Christ and the church. I mean, it was, but people didn't know that. In the Old Testament, God revealed things progressively. There were things that were not wrong earlier that were wrong later, like marrying your brother or your sister. Adam and Eve's kids had to marry their brothers and sisters. Later in the law of Moses, that was forbidden. That was not okay anymore. But even as late as the time of Abraham married his half-sister Sarah, and that wasn't scandalous. That was just not forbidden yet. As God gave more revelation throughout history, He made clearer and clearer what things really need to be ditched, what kind of things shouldn't be done that were permitted earlier. Permitted not because they were better or good, but just permitted because it wasn't one of the things that God was working on changing yet. And why not? Why wouldn't God go immediately to polygamy, say no polygamy? There's, I think, two reasons why polygamy was permitted in the Old Testament. And this would apply, of course, to David and Solomon and some of the kings that followed him, too. One was that it was more important than we can imagine in our society that somebody have an heir. That is, they leave their estate to someone of the next generation. That a man should not die childless. Because in the Old Testament, they didn't know about the next life. The fact that there's another life after this in heaven or hell was not revealed in the Old Testament. It's revealed in the New Testament. Throughout the 4,000 years of Old Testament history, there's not one prophet, not one writer who revealed information about the next life. The Jews, as far as they knew, they live this life and they die, and whatever is after that is a mystery. Maybe nothing is after that. They go to Sheol, which is a place where there's nothing distinctly known. And so, it's hard for us to mentally transport ourselves back to these ancient times because we've had 2,000 years of familiarity with the New Testament. And the New Testament has shaped our culture for 2,000 years to the point where we can't imagine anyone thinking differently. But that's our own narrow-mindedness. You have to realize that for a longer period than that, people didn't have the New Testament. People had different cultures, especially in the Middle East. That's about as... Even today, the culture in the Middle East is very different than the Western culture most of us are familiar with. They still have polygamy in Muslim lands. Islam allows a man to have 4 wives. Of course, Muhammad himself had far more than that, and his favorite one was 8 years old. But, that's Middle Eastern cultures, a lot different than the cultures affected by Christianity. And we have been pensioners of the light that has come through the body of Christ and the church and the Bible and the Testament for so long that we just can't even imagine that anyone ever thought differently. But they do. They still do in some parts of the world, and they did in the Old Testament time. The idea in the Old Testament was, since you don't know what happens after you die, the thing that can make you happiest and most fulfilled is to know that you're leaving your heritage to somebody else who's from your own body. In a sense, you're continuing yourself through your kids because they are you. After all, where'd they come from? One cell from you, one cell from your wife becomes a new person. That person's partly you. You are extending yourself into the future by offspring. Otherwise, there's no immortality that they have any hold of. And so, for example, to receive, to have a child to leave the inheritance to is very important. In fact, it was even important that it be a son instead of a daughter. Again, we might say, well, that's chauvinistic, to value a son more than a daughter. But there was a reason for that too. Because a daughter would eventually marry a man and become an extension of that man's parents' estate. Just as happens now, when a woman gets married, she takes her husband's name. That's his father, and his grandfather, his great-grandfather's name. And her children would carry on her husband's name, not her dad's name. It's always been that way. And so, that being the case, having a daughter meant, well, a man might love his daughter, but she's not going to be able to carry on his name. She's going to get married and carry on someone else's name. So a man wanted a son. Again, not just because sons were considered to be more valuable. I don't know if they were or not. I'm sure women were considered valuable in their own sphere, but not having a daughter wasn't going to help you carry on your family name. So everyone wanted a son. Remember Jephthah in the book of Judges? He had a daughter, no son. And when she had to be committed either to sacrifice or something to think more to perpetual virginity, as I think, that meant he's going to have no more offspring. Of course, it wasn't going to help in any way if she got married and had kids, because they wouldn't be his name, whoever her husband's name. So it was actually considered very tragic in the Middle East to have no sons. And even more tragic than that, to have no offspring at all. Now what happened very often is a man would marry a woman and she turned out to be barren. Remember? Abram married Sarah. Sarai, when he married her. She turned out to be barren. Well, she herself suggested going to Hagar, have a child. You know, I mean, no modern wife would ever suggest that to her husband. Hey, I'm not giving you a kiss, why don't you sleep with this other young chick? You know, have some kids by her. It was clear that the mentality about marriage was having kids is what it's about. It wasn't the same as we understand it now. It was an arrangement to perpetuate a family line. So even a man's wife, like Sarah, might suggest to him, Aaron, why don't you have some kids by this lady? It's culturally unthinkable to us, but you can see it in the Bible. And then, of course, Jacob, when Leah stopped having children, she gave Jacob her maid to have 4 children. Rachel was barren, she gave Jacob her maid to have children. It's like having kids was so important that a wife would even share her husband with another man, a woman, so that they can have some kids. And so you got to just realize, when you read the Bible, you're reading foreign stuff, foreign culture. All right? Now, that being so, if a man had no children by a barren wife, for him to have another wife who was not barren was an important thing. And apparently, God didn't forbid that. Even the wives didn't forbid it. It was just there's different values than we have right now. And I think, Samuel was born to a woman who had been barren, Hannah. But she was one of 2 wives. Elkanah, her husband, had another wife named Peninnah. Peninnah had children. Hannah didn't. Although we're not told this is the case, it's probable that Hannah was his first wife. And because of her barrenness, he probably had taken Peninnah. But you can tell he loved Hannah. I think Peninnah was very little else than a child oven for him. Because he loved Hannah. You can tell the way he talked to her, he loved her. He probably wouldn't have married a second wife if Hannah had not been barren. And that was often the way it was. Men would often take another wife because the wife they had, maybe the only wife they wanted. Couldn't have babies. It was very important to have babies. Now the other thing that may have caused God to tolerate it is that there was so much war that the male population would frequently get decimated. Syrians, Assyrians, Edomites, Egyptians coming in, wiping out soldiers and the male population to a large degree, left a lot of women widows or a lot of unmarried women without potential husbands. Now, just like it was a disaster in that culture for a man to die without an heir, it was very much a disaster for a girl to not be able to get married and have kids. And in a situation where there's maybe the male population is much smaller than the female population because they've been wiped out in war, for a man to have more than one wife was in some sense the ticket for some of these women to not be just left to beg or to be prostitutes or do something else. I mean, they didn't live in our modern Western society where they could just go out and become an executive in a corporation. They didn't have jobs, generally speaking, for women outside the home. So for a woman who'd lost her husband, or some young woman who didn't have any likelihood of finding a husband because there's so few men surviving the war, a lot of times for the surviving men to have multiple wives was not unthinkable. In fact, if you look at Isaiah chapter 4, this very situation is envisaged. At the end of Isaiah 3, and then going into chapter 4, because the chapter divisions, of course, are artificial. They weren't put there by Isaiah. It says in Isaiah 3, verse 25 and 26, "Your men shall fall by the sword, and your warriors in battle. And her gates shall lament and mourn, ravaged, she shall sit upon the ground. 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, We will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes, just let us be called by your name, and take away our disgrace." That's the same. The same, there will be so many war casualties among the men of Israel, that there will be 7 women left for each man. And there will be like 7 women saying, "Listen, we don't want to be a financial burden on you, but just marry us so we won't be husbandless, childless." You know, apparently a lot of these women are widows. And, but you see, the picture is of a case where there's 7 women for every surviving man. And in a situation like that, again, because the cultural values being what they were, for God to allow them to have polygamy, He didn't say to have polygamy, He just didn't condemn it in the Old Testament. He didn't say don't do it. And if He had, it would have put a tremendous strain on a number of important values that even God could read. It was important, maybe not as important to God as to people, but that a woman should be able to have a husband to take care of, or that even if she has to share it with someone else. Now those situations we've outgrown. The New Testament has pretty much laid the foundation for a different understanding of marriage. A man's supposed to love his wife like Christ loves the church. We expect that now. We expect when we marry someone that it's going to be exclusive. You know? Husband and wife have equal rights in the marriage. That's understood. That all comes from the New Testament. But it didn't come from the Old Testament. So when you say, was it a sin? It was not forbidden. We could say that polygamy in the Old Testament was not measuring up to God's ideal, as many things did not. It's like when, you know, the people said, "It's okay to divorce your wife," in Matthew 19. They asked Jesus, "Is it okay to divorce your wife for any cause?" He said, "What do you read in the Scripture? For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. If they're one flesh, then don't break up what God has put together." And they said, "Well, then why did Moses command us to give our wives a writing of divorce?" And Jesus said, "Well, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses permitted you to divorce your wife, but from the beginning it was not so." Now you see, Jesus is saying God never did like divorce. He permitted it, but He didn't like it. He just didn't say anything against it yet, because of the hardness in their heart. And that's what we see in the Old Testament. Lots of times in the Old Testament we see God tolerating. You know, some people think that in the Old Testament God's very intolerant, because He'll strike out at somebody who offers strange fire in the tabernacle. He'll just kill them on the spot, or He'll have someone stoned to death who broke the Sabbath. Boy, is that God in the Old Testament? Is He ever intolerant? Oh, it's the opposite. He tolerated far more in the Old Testament than in the New. There's so many things in human society that He just held His peace about. He didn't like it. He didn't like divorce, but because of the hardness of their hearts, He let them do that. I don't think He liked polygamy, because that did serve some genuine purpose in the lives of people who, in that culture, who had certain values. He didn't say anything against it. But in the New Testament, He tells us, you know, what really are His ideas about these things. So that's, did David sin by having many wives? He didn't break any particular commandment in doing it. Did Solomon sin by having 1,000 or 700 wives, 300 concubines? Well, he kind of did break a commandment there, but it's only a matter of degree, really, because David had 8 wives and Solomon had 700. Certainly there was a difference there. Although, frankly, by our standards, we condemn David too, you know, by our modern standards. But God had said in Deuteronomy 17 that the kings of Israel should not multiply wives themselves. David might have argued, I didn't multiply, I just added. I only have 8. But you don't get 700 without multiplying something like that. You're doing rapid math somehow. So anyway, these are things that kind of God winked at in times of ignorance. And so the Bible does not treat the polygamy of the ancients, the polygamy of Abraham or Jacob or Elkanah or David or Solomon. It doesn't treat that at itself as sin, although in the case of Solomon, we find in chapter 11, his wives were of the wrong sort. He married pagan women, and then he accommodated their paganism. He built temples to their gods in Jerusalem, and this led him away from God too. So it's not so much the number of wives he had that he gets criticized for, it's the kind of women he married that led him away from the Lord. He was unequally yoked. Too many unbelievers. In any case, I don't want to give the impression that I'm thinking polygamy is an okay thing. I'm just saying we have to put ourselves in the position of recognizing that we are reading foreign stuff, extremely far removed from us in culture, in geography, and in time. And what in David having 8 wives, he was not doing anything that the average Jew couldn't necessarily do. Although most Jews couldn't afford to support 8 wives, there was nothing in the law that said he couldn't have 8 wives if he could support them. And Solomon, having lots of wives, was not doing much else than what most kings at the time would have, in which there was no law saying he couldn't do. But we could say he was excessive, and by New Testament standards, he was doing the wrong thing. But they didn't have the New Testament standards yet. All right? So, Abishag. Abishag would have been of the status of a concubine. Adonijah, one of David's sons, asked for her in marriage. We'll see later on. And that got him killed. But it certainly isn't just because Solomon may have had designs on Abishag himself. But taking Abishag, if Adonijah, the oldest son of David, had David's concubine in marriage, in the culture of that time, that would have given him a pretty credible claim to be David's successor. And Solomon saw that his half-brother Adonijah, who had already tried to steal the kingdom in chapter 1, he tried to get it another way by marrying Abishag, and so Solomon saw that as not behaving himself. Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. So we do read about this girl being brought in. The reason she's brought in is partly because that David was sick in his old age, so sick his body wouldn't generate heat. But also, more importantly, to introduce this girl who becomes the occasion of Adonijah's death, eventually. Okay? Now, verse 5 says, Now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be the king. Now, he was the oldest son of David, and David was dying. Usually, when a king dies, his next son in line takes the throne. So why doesn't Adonijah just wait until David's dead and just automatically succeed at the throne? Because David had already made known, although apparently not officially, he had made it known that he intended for his son Solomon, who was much younger, possibly only 12 or 15 years old, that Solomon would be his successor to the throne. So Adonijah, who felt he had a better claim to it, decided that before David dies, he's going to sneakily get Israel to proclaim him the king before Solomon can have a chance. So he invites guys who were sympathetic toward him. Some of them were people who had been sympathetic toward David and had stood with David against Absalom for dying. Like Joab, David's long-term general, and Abiathar, the priest. These were important people in Israel, and they were on Adonijah's side. And Adonijah decided to throw a big feast in another town outside from Jerusalem, and have a bunch of people there who would proclaim him king. In those days, they didn't have a constitution that says, here's how you replace one president you vote, and on this day he becomes president, and so on. In those days, anyone could make himself king if he had enough popular support. Now, he'd be a usurper if he wasn't the successor to the previous king, but he could still do it. And Adonijah was really illegitimately trying to kind of go over David's head. Because David wanted Solomon to succeed him, but before David even died and Solomon was even put on the throne, Adonijah thought, I can get a jump on this. I'll get the country proclaiming Adonijah as king. And once the country's proclaiming that possession is 9/10 of the law, I'm in. You know, let Solomon try to overthrow me then. So this was done behind Solomon's back. And some of the people that weren't sympathetic for it were not invited. Adonijah knew who would support him and who wouldn't. One of the people that wouldn't support him was Nathan the prophet. And so Nathan was not invited to this ceremony. But it says in verse 9, Adonijah sacrificed sheep, oxen, and fatted cattle by the stone Zoheleth, which is beside Enrogel. And he invited all his brothers, the king's sons, except Solomon, and all the royal officials of Judah, but he did not invite the prophet Nathan or Benaiah or the warriors or his brother Solomon. So of all his brothers, he didn't invite Solomon. And he didn't invite the guy who, under Joab, was one of his chief generals. They were too loyal to Solomon because they knew David's wishes, so they weren't invited. Then Nathan said to Bathsheba, who was Solomon's mom, this is going on. So she went to David and said, listen, this is going on. David didn't know anything about it. He's in bed. He's bedridden. And so Nathan heard of it. He told Bathsheba. She told David. And David said, okay, we're going to undo this. We're going to proclaim Solomon as king. So David quickly gathered those who were loyal to him and went through the streets of Jerusalem proclaiming Solomon reigned. Now this was a little premature because usually he wouldn't reign until David died. But because of what Adonijah was up to, something had to be done to undercut Adonijah's claim. So when the people who were with Adonijah heard the people in the city shouting, Solomon reigns, they suddenly realized they had backed the wrong horse. That Solomon was now the king, and with David's approval while David lived, he'd appointed him. That means that to follow Adonijah would be to be rebellious against David, because you'd be traitors. Adonijah himself becomes a traitor. And it says that everybody who had been there with Adonijah dispersed. They all ran off. They didn't want to be known to have been associated with him. Because now Solomon is the king, and he can do what he wants with these people. Now, that's what happened in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, David gives instructions to Solomon. And among the instructions he gives, he tells him to get rid of Joab and Shimei. Now you may remember from the books of Samuel, Joab had offended David a number of times. First of all, Joab had committed war crime. He was the general over all the armies of Israel under David. But he did some pretty nasty things. For one thing, Joab actually had two brothers, Asahel and Abishai. And in wars that had taken place when David was ruling only over Judah, and when Saul's son Ishbosheth was still ruling over the tribes to the north, this is after when Saul died, the tribe of Judah, which was David's tribe, invited him to reign over them. But the other tribes were still following Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. And during those wars, one of the guys who was leading the armies of Ishbosheth was a guy named Abner. And in a conflict, Abner killed Asahel. Abner was the general of the northern tribes under Saul's son. Asahel was the brother of Joab, and Joab was the general of David. So Abner, the general from the north, kills Asahel, which makes Joab, Asahel's brother, angry. And so, at one point, Abner decided to defect from the north to David. Abner, who had killed Asahel, comes to David to negotiate some kind of a merger between the two nations, the two groups of tribes. And Joab goes out and kills Abner, partly to retaliate against the death of his own brother. However, his brother was killed in war. Abner hadn't murdered Asahel. In fact, Asahel had been fleet-footed, was pursuing Abner in battle, and Abner kept saying to him, "Go back, I don't want to kill you." Abner was running from him, and Asahel was chasing him. And Abner kept saying, "Asahel, go back, I don't want to get your brother Joab mad at me by killing you." And Asahel ignored him. And so, Abner, stabbed him with actually the blunt end of his spear, went through it, and killed Asahel that way. But it was a war situation. It wasn't like killing in cold blood. In fact, it could have been even seen as self-defense in that case. But Joab killed Abner in cold blood. So Joab, sure, he's a military man, but that's still a war crime. You don't just go out and kill innocent people, especially when they're negotiating with your team for, truce. Just don't kill him. And then, of course, beyond that, Joab had killed Absalom. Now, remember, David didn't want Absalom dead. Although Absalom wanted David dead, when Absalom drove David out of Jerusalem, and those loyal to David, those loyal to Absalom, were going to fight, David said to his own troops, "Go easy with my son Absalom, don't hurt him." And David was sentimental. He wasn't politically very smart. Joab was really politically much smarter than David. And Joab knew it's ridiculous to keep Absalom alive. He's a troublemaker. He's going to, if he gets away with this, he'll try it again. Joab was wiser politically to know that killing Absalom was necessary. David had his heart for his son. And Joab ignored David's instructions. When Absalom's head got caught in a branch of the tree, some guy came and reported it to Joab, and Joab said, "Why didn't you kill him?" The guy said, "Are you kidding me? I'm not going to kill David's son." I heard what he said about it. So Joab said, "You never send a boy to do a man's job." So he went out, and Joab killed Absalom as he's hanging from the tree. The soldier who didn't kill Absalom, whom Joab blamed for not doing so, was smart. First of all, he knew that David didn't want Absalom killed. He also knew that if you make David angry by killing someone you don't think you should kill, David doesn't go easy on him. Remember the two men who killed Ishbosheth? They cut off his head and brought it to David, because Ishbosheth was David's rival king. And they said, "We killed Ishbosheth." They expected a reward from David. Also the guy who claimed that he killed Saul. These people came to David hoping for a reward, and he had them killed because they were treacherous and slew the Lord's anointed. So this guy who wouldn't kill Absalom, he knew what side of the bread and butter is on. If I kill Absalom, I know what David's going to do to me. You kill him if you want Joab. And Joab did it. But Joab was so powerful that David could do very little against Joab. Joab was invulnerable. And so Joab had killed people that David didn't want killed, and some very badly. And so he never really had the power to overthrow Absalom. And also, he was his cousin. You know that? Joab was David's cousin. Asahel, Abishai, and Joab, the three brothers, are frequently called the sons of Zeruiah. He always called, what are they doing, you sons of Zeruiah? Zeruiah was David's aunt. Zeruiah is a woman's name. And according to 1 Chronicles 2:16, she was David's sister. So, actually, I should say they were cousins. Joab was David's nephew. David was the uncle to these men. And so David was a little too lenient at times when he shouldn't be. There's a lot to be said for being merciful, but if you're a king, you've got to look out for political dangers and you've got to deal with them in a decisive way. And David just wasn't that way. He was earlier in his life, but he wasn't later in his life. And the thing that changed it was the sin of Bathsheba. Before the sin of Bathsheba, David was a man's man, a warrior's warrior, a king who was a no-nonsense ruler. He'd kill the bad guys and go out after the invaders and wipe them out and so forth. But then after he sinned with Bathsheba, you might remember, he repented eventually when Nathan confronted him. And Nathan said, "Okay, God's forgiven you, you're not going to die, but the sword will never depart from your house all the days of your life." Notice, you killed a man and taken his life. You should die. God has declared because you repented you won't die, but the consequences are going to be bad in your house. Your house is going to be without peace. And the next thing that happened of importance was that David's son, Amnon, raped David's daughter, Tamar. Now, we're not full brothers and sisters, we're from different wives of David, but Tamar was Absalom's full sister. and Amnon was a half-brother. But Amnon raped Tamar. And you know, it's a really interesting thing because we read in 2 Samuel 13:21, David heard about it and he was angry. But he didn't do anything about it. Here, his own daughter's been raped. He hears about it, it makes him angry, but he doesn't do anything. He's just like, he's ineffective. As a father and as a leader, rape should be punished. And he doesn't do anything. Why? Why do you suppose? You know, when a father has had a humiliating sin in his own life, it's hard to confront with moral authority his kids when they do things like that. He probably thought, well, if I confront Amnon about this sin, Amnon could just say, well, look what you did to Bathsheba. And David said, yeah, it's true. You know, I mean, you kind of lose when you sin notoriously, as David had, you kind of lose moral credibility, moral authority, and it makes it really hard to be a good parent when your kids go wrong because it's like kids. My generation, myself accepted, but my generation smoked a lot of dope. I didn't because I was a Christian from my childhood when I was in ministry, but when I was a teenager. I never smoked dope. But everyone I knew did. I don't think I know anyone else my age who didn't. But the thing is, when they now, who are Christian parents, who smoke dope when they're teenagers, try to tell their kids, you shouldn't be smoking marijuana, it's a little hard. I'm not saying it's not valid to do so, but it's still hard. Because the kids say, well, didn't you smoke marijuana? Well, yeah, I did, actually. You know, when you've got a conscience problem because of something you did, it's hard to stand up as if you have the moral high ground to tell your kids what to do. And I think that's what was going on in David's life. David was ashamed, and because he had sinned, frankly, in a sense, even worse than his son did, because David killed somebody in the act. David got angry when his son Amnon did this, but he didn't do anything. And his failure to do what he should have done made Absalom, Tamar's full brother, angry at David. And that eventually led to the rebellion against David. So the sword had come into David's house. And, Absalom eventually killed Amnon to avenge his sister. And then Absalom had to flee because he's now a murderer. But eventually David let him come back to Jerusalem. He said, I don't want to see him. But he can come back and live in his house. I don't want to see him. We see that in 2 Samuel 14:24. So David, here, his son is a murderer now, and David doesn't punish him. He says, I'm going to grant you amnesty, but I want to see him. It's like, are you forgiven or are you not forgiven? It's like there's all this indecisiveness in David in these later years. And this indecisiveness is seen also in his treatment of Joab. Because Joab does things that should be punished, but there's other issues there too. I mean, David didn't have quite the moral authority to execute Joab necessarily, but for killing Absalom and so forth. But there are other issues too, because David was afraid of Joab. We know this because he said so in 2 Samuel 3, and this is early on in David's reign, but in 2 Samuel 3. In verse 39, it says, David was speaking to his servants. And he says in verse 38, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? That is, this is when Abner was killed by Joab. He says, today I am powerless, even though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, meaning Joab and his surviving brother Abishai, are too violent for me. The Lord pay back the one who does wickedly in accordance with his wickedness. Now, David was a wimp. At a certain point in his life, he just kind of wimped out. He says, Joab's, he's technically my servant. I'm the king. I'm anointed king, but he's the general. He could have a military coup if I made him unhappy enough. I'm afraid he's more violent than I am. I'm a warrior, but he's scary, And so he was his nephew. John was his nephew, which probably made him not eager to kill him. He was afraid of him. And so anyway, David was really indecisive. But at the end of his life, in chapter 2 of 1 Kings, he tells Solomon, you know, I've left some things undone that really need to be done. Joab really should be put to death for what he did. And Shimei should also. Remember who Shimei was? When David was run out of Jerusalem by his son Absalom, Shimei was some Benjamite, loyal to the house of Saul. And he was throwing dirt and rocks at David as he was living. And here, David wasn't alone. He had hundreds of warriors with him. But this guy Shimei was just taking advantage of the fact that David was demoralized by his son who drive him out of town. And he just said, you're a bloodthirsty man. God is doing this to you because of the evils you did against the house of Saul. The irony about this is this had nothing to do with his sins against the house of Saul. He had never committed any sins against the house of Saul. This was happening because of his sins against Uriah, and having Uriah killed and taken his wife Bathsheba. That was the upshot of it. But Shimei didn't know that. But Abishai, Joab's brother, said to David about Shimei, why should this dead dog curse the king? Just send me over there, I'll take his head off. And David said, how long do I subvert you, sons of Zeruiah? They're violent men. He says, no one's going to die today. If God sent him to curse me, let him curse me. If God sees me as innocent, let God do the king. That's what David said at that time. We don't really see David acting as a mighty warrior at all. But Shimei had been a traitor, no question about it. And when David came back in peace after Absalom's death, Shimei came down and said, oh, forgive me, I spoke unwisely. Oh, yeah, I guess so. Do you think? And David said, I'm not going to kill you today. You go to your house. You know, this is the day to celebrate, not the day to kill people. So David let Shimei live, but the man was still a scoundrel. And so David, on his deathbed, commissioned Solomon to build the temple, but also kill Joab and to kill Shimei. Both of them deserved it. Now, some might think that David was being kind of vindictive, and also because David had been indecisive. Why is he throwing off this unpleasant job on his son, Solomon? Isn't this really kind of unfinished business for David? Shouldn't he man up and do this himself? Well, he had already promised Shimei that Shimei wouldn't die at his hand, so he couldn't go back on that. But he didn't promise that he wouldn't die at Solomon's. And likewise, I don't know why he left it to Solomon to kill Joab instead of doing it himself. But again, it might have been some family feelings there, I don't know. But basically, he said these guys got to go. And they did need to go. Because Solomon, if Shimei was still around, he would be reasserting his complaints against the house of David. Very likely, the man was a traitor. And Joab has shown himself to be unreliable. He's chanting Adonijah. He's not on Solomon's side. So I think David's also giving Solomon some astute political advice. These guys will overthrow you if they can. Don't let that happen. They both deserve to die. Make sure they get executed, or else your kingdom will not be established. Your kingdom will be threatened by them. I'm pretty sure that's what was going on in David's mind. Now, when David died and Solomon was made king, what Solomon did, Adonijah came to Solomon and said, please don't kill me. And Solomon said, well, if you behave yourself, I'm not going to kill you. Just behave. So Adonijah went away. Then David turned to Abiathar, who was the priest who had supported Adonijah. He says, you're out. You're not going to be a priest anymore. Zadok's to be a priest now. Abiathar had supported David in the rebellion of Absalom. Abiathar stayed with David on that. But there was another priest at the same level named Zadok. And Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood, and Zadok became the main priest. And the Bible says that in Solomon's removing him, look at chapter 2. Verse 27, so Solomon banished Abiathar from being priest to the Lord, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord that he had spoken concerning the house of Eli at Shiloh. You remember that? That was like back in 1 Samuel chapter 2. When Eli was the high priest, a prophet came and said, God's going to remove you and your sons from the priesthood, and he's going to replace your line with a godly priesthood, which is the priesthood of Zadok. And this was the fulfillment of that. Some generations after the fact, 2 or 3 generations later, now all of Eli's descendants, which Abiathar was, are now removed from the priesthood. Now, of course, verse 28 says, the news came to Joab. It says, Joab had supported Adonijah, though he had not supported Absalom. And Joab fled to the tent of the Lord, and he grasped the horns of the altar. When it was told King Solomon, Joab has fled to the tent of the Lord, and now is beside the altar, Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, saying, go strike him down. So Benaiah, who is also one of the chief warriors, came to the tent of the Lord and said to him, the king commands, come out. But Joab said, no, I will die here. Then Benaiah brought the king word again, saying, thus said Joab, and his answer to me. And the king replied to him, do as he said, strike him down and bury him, and thus take away from me and from my father's house the guilt of the blood that Joab shed without cause, meaning when he killed Abner without cause. So Joab gets struck dead there. This is really fairly tragic. I mean, the man deserved it. He had committed crimes. But the sad thing is, even after he committed those crimes, he had been a really loyal champion for David. He had led the armies to fight Absalom's armies and restore David to the kingship. He had objected when David wanted to number the people, and he raised the mission. No, that's not a good thing to do. But Joab wasn't all bad, but he'd done some pretty nasty things for which he deserved to die. But what's sad is how long he delayed. You know, the crimes he committed were before all these years of loyal service to David. And so by the time he died, he spent more years of loyal service to David than anything else. And here David has him killed. But the last thing Joab had done was support a rebellion under Adonijah. And that meant he's on the wrong side. He's against David really now, because David wants Solomon. Now, why would Joab support Adonijah? Why would Abiathar support Adonijah? Why wouldn't they support Solomon? Probably because Solomon was young. He was somewhere between 12 and 15 years old, according to Josephus and Eusebius, the historian. He was like just barely in his teens. And it may be they didn't want such a young person reigning. Adonijah would have been much older, possibly close to 40 years old, much more respected. Also, it might be that these people, Abiathar and Joab, may have felt that Solomon's birth was still scandalous. After all, he was Bathsheba at the time. I'm not really sure what made these guys want to champion Adonijah over Solomon, but it was the case that they did, and that put them on the wrong side of Israel's history, and Joab was put to death. Now, what about Shimei? Solomon called him in and said, listen, I should kill you, but I'll tell you what I'll do. You go stay in your house, and don't leave the borders of your city, because if you leave the borders of your city, you're going to die. Well, 3 years later, Shimei had a couple slaves who ran away. They escaped from the area, and he left his city to go and regain them, capture them. And for that, he was put to death because he did not keep the terms of his life. It doesn't seem very smart for a guy who, if he leaves his city when he's put to death by the king, to go ahead and risk that just to recover some slaves. Let him go. I'm not going to get my head cut off for them. But Shimei was a rebel through and through, and he just probably didn't take the decree of Solomon very seriously at all. Okay, so Solomon is now king. He has purged the opposition. He goes to a place called Gibeon in chapter 3. And there he's offering sacrifices to the Lord. He's a young man, too young really to know how to reign. And God appears to him in a dream. And you can see in chapter 3, verse 5. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask what I should give you. And Solomon said, you have shown great and steadfast love to your servant, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and in righteousness and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne today. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father the king. Although I am only a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern this your great people? And it pleased the Lord that Solomon has asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches, or for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, I now will do according to your word. Indeed, I give you a wise and discerning mind. No one like you has been before you, and no one like you shall rise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor all the days of your life. No one will walk in my, no other king shall compare with you. If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father made to walk, then I will lengthen your life. So Solomon woke up into the dream. It was a dream, but it was real. God did make him the wisest man, and that's what we read about in the rest of chapter 3 and in chapter 4. He was very famous for his wisdom. He also was very rich and powerful. This shows that God appreciates people who are not too ambitious for selfish things. I mean, what did Solomon really want? He had a responsibility. He wanted to discharge his responsibility wisely and well. He knew himself to be inadequate. You know, I'm a little child. Who can govern this great people you've made? These are special people, too. I don't want to do it wrong. I guess if I could ask for just anything, if this was a genie in a lamp saying you've got one wish, I guess I'll just ask that I don't blow it. I guess I'll ask that I'm smart enough to govern these people. And God saw that as a very unselfish choice and rewarded him, gave him what he asked for and what he didn't ask for. The good things that he didn't ask for. Now, there's a problem here, because as we read Solomon's life, he ended up doing some pretty stupid things. Not the least of which was marrying all of those foreign wives and then following their gods and bringing disaster on the nation. That's not too smart. And it makes you wonder, you know, if God made him the wisest man in the world, why did he end up bringing such harm on the nation? Well, God made it very clear. He says, if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments. That's an if. God said, I'll make you the wisest man if you're obedient to me. Now, there's always free choice. Even a wise and smart man has choices he can make. He can get a little proud. When a man gets proud, he sometimes starts forgetting God. Certainly when a man gets rich, he can begin forgetting God. There are a lot of things Solomon had that every man in the world wanted. But he had them. And he was young. And it's hard to stay humble when you're wealthy. Remember, Jesus said it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God than for a camel to go through that needle. Solomon was the richest man in the world. That presents spiritual stumbling blocks sometimes. Paul said in 1 Timothy 6, he said, those who would be rich fall into many hurtful lusts and snares and troubles and perdition and destruction. Wealth can be very hard on a person's humility and on his faith in God. Because if you have a lot of money, it's hard not to forget God. There's a guy named Agur who wrote Proverbs chapter 30. And Agur wrote in chapter 30, he says, he's praying, he says, God, give me neither riches or poverty, lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God, or lest I be rich and forget God. He knew there was that tendency. If I get rich, I might forget God. Certainly there have been many who have done that. And Solomon was blessed, but even though he had wisdom, he still had his lusts. He still had his free choices. A man who's very wise might still be morally led astray. Being wise isn't the most important thing, although it's a very important thing. And when Solomon wrote the Proverbs, it's clear that he extolled wisdom very highly. In fact, he had learned, you might say, why would a young man even ask for wisdom? I mean, if you, when you were in your teens, had God shall say, I'll give you anything you want, what would you ask for? I don't know, but it'd be probably more selfish than just asking for wisdom. Like, make me rich, or make me famous, or make me never get sick, or make me live a long, happy life. I mean, there's all kinds of selfish things a person might ask for. Most teenagers wouldn't ask for, but why would Solomon even have the wisdom to ask for wisdom? That's interesting, because you have to be wise to realize that wisdom is more important than a lot of other things you might ask for. He was already somewhat wise. I think we have, in chapter 4 of Proverbs chapter 4, I think he tells us how he got this disposition to want wisdom. Proverbs chapter 4, at the very beginning of the chapter, says, listen, children, to a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight. For I give you good precepts. Do not forsake my teaching. When I was a son of my father, tender in my mother's favor, he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments and live, get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Whatever else you get insight. Now, this is Solomon saying, my dad, when I was a little kid, taught me this. When I was on my father's knee, he said, get wisdom. Make that the chief thing you go for. And apparently that stuck with him. And so when God said, what do you want? He said, I want wisdom. And he got it. And but the wisdom he got was not necessarily spiritual wisdom. There was a spiritual element of it. As we see in the Proverbs, it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. There's a spiritual element to it. But his wisdom was mainly the wisdom of governing. How to govern a nation. That's what he was asking about. He says, I'm too young, I'm a king, I'm supposed to govern. I don't have any wisdom. Give me an understanding heart so I can govern your people properly. So, in other words, he was made to be a shrewd manager, a shrewd ruler. That's what his wisdom largely was. He could use that for good or for ill. He eventually used it for ill. He oppressed the people and put extraordinary taxes upon them that made them want to rebel. Because he used his shrewd governing ability in a way that wasn't really morally right. And that's partly because he was morally compromising himself in other ways. But an example of his wisdom and how he became famous for his wisdom is found in chapter 3. If you look at chapter 3, the latter part, we have this wonderful story. Verse 16, later 2 women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house. And I gave birth while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. So they had 2 babies in the house, 3 days apart in age. We were together. There was no one else with us in the house. Only the 2 of us were in the house, so there's no witnesses except us. Can't call any more witnesses. This is a court case here. The only witnesses are the 2 women. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. Accidentally probably smothered him in sleep. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your servant slept. She laid him at her breast and laid her dead son in my breast. When I arose in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, clearly it was not my son I had born. But the other woman said, no, the living son is mine, and the dead son is yours. The first said, no, the dead son is yours, and the living son is mine. So they argued before the king. Now this is an example of the kind of case in court might come to court, a custody case. Who's the real, this is a maternity case. Who's the real mother? Now, they didn't have DNA testing back then. You might not realize that if you're under 30 years old. They didn't have it back then, DNA testing. They couldn't establish that way whose child it really was. But how would you decide? There were no witnesses. So the women knew, both of them knew whose baby it was. Both of them knew who was lying and who was telling the truth. But there were no other witnesses. How does a judge in a court settle a case like that and nobody's done the right thing? Well, Solomon said, the one says, this is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. While the other says, not so. Your son is dead, my son is the living one. So the king said, bring me a sword. And they brought a sword before the king, and the king said, divide the living boy in two. Then give half to one and half to the other. That's a real smart judgment, isn't it? Of course he didn't intend for that to happen. He knew what would happen. That's because he was smart. Because he was wise. This was a psychological manipulation of the situation, and the women were just not as wise as he was. So the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because of compassion for her son burned within her, please, my lord, give her the living boy. Certainly do not kill him. In other words, I'll give up my baby. You just don't let him die. Let her have it rather than kill him. The other said, it shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide it. Well, it's obvious which is the real mother. But you can see this rivalry between these two women in the same house. You don't want two women living in the same house. Generally. Anyone here from China? Any Chinese people here? I've been told, the Chinese character for the word impossible is the character for two women under one roof. I believe that's true. I'm not sure. But a woman needs her nest. If there's another woman who thinks that's her nest, there could be friction. Usually there is. There was with these two anyway. Enough so that the guilty woman didn't even care if the other woman's baby was killed. At least she has something I don't have. There's this heavy rivalry. She lost her son. What does she care about this other son? Let us each have half. Of course, you just throw each half away. But at least this lady who lives with me won't be able to, strut around with her baby while I don't have one. So better to have none. Yes. How old was the king at this time? We're not given an exact chronology. So my impression is this is very early in his reign, so he's probably under 20. But we don't know. I think he probably was still in his late teens. But we don't have any exact information given on that. It's just that this particular ruling was an early one that gave him a reputation internationally for being brilliant. What were you saying beyond that?
Yeah, just like the fact that they were asking, maybe he was so young, and they really have that much
Well, she said, why would they have any confidence in such a young king to settle a matter like this? I don't know if they have much confidence in that he was the ruler. In other words, there was a property dispute here. The baby was the property, and each of them claimed that it was theirs. They had to take it to court to get it settled, or else they pulled the baby to themselves, So this was not so much a matter of them having a lot of confidence in it, so much as they're going to the highest authorities, the king. Whatever he says, the other one has to go along with it. So they're hoping, each one is hoping that the king will rule on their side. I don't know if they had confidence that he would figure it out or not. I'm sure they were surprised when he did, because the king then responded, give the first woman the living boy, do not kill it, shoot the mother. Says all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice. Now this is just one court case that's recorded. He must have handled court cases on a daily basis. In those days, it wasn't like a modern, highly developed society. You really could go to see the king if you wanted to. If you had a court case. Not always. I think in the days of David, judges would sit at the gate of the city, like Absalom did. And people would come with their disputes to the gate of the city to the judges. And if it was something they thought the king should handle, it'd go on to the king. And he would take the case to the king. Sort of like appealing to a higher court. And these women probably had gone through that process, probably had already talked to some judges at the gate, and thought, well, we can't figure this out, so there's not up the ladder to the king. And so, anyway, his ability to solve it so easily, because he knew human nature, was what made him extremely famous. Now, we're not going to say much about chapter 4, we're going to quit here in a moment, but in chapter 4, there's sort of an extended description of how rich, how famous, how powerful, how wise Solomon was. And with reference to his wisdom, if you look at chapter 4, in chapter 4, verses 29 through 34, it says, God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, and breadth of understanding as vast as the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East, and all the wisdom of Egypt. Now, wise men were sort of a privileged class in the ancient world, in the East, because everybody needed to know what to do. And some people spent their whole life philosophizing. Job and his friends were that kind of people. They were wise men in the East. And they would philosophize. We would call them philosophers today. But they would think deeply about how life works. They would think deeply about what's the end result going to be of this course of action. They were wise enough to foresee the distant outcomes of things. And therefore, people like that were generally brought into the kings to give advice to the kings. So the kings had wise men for counsel. For example, Ahithophel was one of David's wise men. And he was so wise, the Bible said that Ahithophel's reputation for wisdom was so great that they said, if you inquire of Ahithophel, it's like inquiring from the Lord himself. It's like inquiring from an oracle of God. Now, Ahithophel was not inspired. He wasn't an oracle or a prophet. But his wisdom was so great, you just couldn't beat it. It was almost like it was God's wisdom. Now, that was in David's day. Solomon became wiser than Ahithophel. And not only wiser than Ahithophel, but wiser than all the other wise men that were known at that time. It names some of them. It says here in verse 31, he was wiser than anyone else. Wiser than Ethan, the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calco, and Darda, children of Mahol. By the way, Ethan the Ezrahite and Heman both, who was also an Ezrahite, they both wrote songs. We have, I think, one psalm each of those two guys in the book of Psalms. It says, his fame spread throughout all the surrounding nations. He, Solomon, composed 3,000 proverbs. Now, our book of Proverbs doesn't have about less than 1,000, about 900 or something proverbs. So we only have less than a third of the proverbs that Solomon wrote or spoke are in our book of Proverbs. The others we don't have anymore. He composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. That's a prolific songwriter. 1,005 songs. Now, we only have one of those. That's the Song of Solomon, which was apparently his favorite. It's the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. It says, he would speak of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows in the wall. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. People came from all the nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon. They came in from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. Now later on in chapter 10 or so, we're going to be reading about somebody who came from the far ends of the earth, the Queen of Sheba, to come and hear his wisdom. But she was just one of many who came from all over the place to hear him speak. Now it says he spoke of trees and plants and animals, reptiles, bugs. He was, in other words, for his day, an expert biologist. You know? He studied plants and animals. And more than that, he saw in them lessons for humans, lessons for life. So in the book of Proverbs we read, go to the ant, you sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Who, having no ruler over her, prepares her food in the summer, so that she might have food in the winter. In other words, recognizing that there's going to be time of need ahead, prepare now. the ants do that, we should be smart like them. And that's what Solomon did. He would look at nature and he'd see actually things that God himself built into the natural world of plants and animals. And he would see what lessons God had for us in those. Jesus did the same thing. Lots of Jesus' parables were about plants, seeds growing, and things like that. And Jesus told a lot of parables about seeds and about growth and compared them to spiritual lessons about the kingdom of God. Solomon said, I walked by the house of a sluggard, a man without understanding. And I noticed his field. It was all grown up with weeds. And the retaining wall was breaking down. He says, then my mind gained wisdom. And understanding came to me. I said, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands, so shall your poverty come upon you like an armed man. Because he saw how nature goes, and he got ideas about human behavior. And so did some of the other wise men like Agur in chapter 30 of Proverbs. He was not Solomon, but he also made some proverbs about animals and things like that. So that's what Solomon did. He looked at the natural world and he'd see the spiritual lessons God had built into it. Next time, we will get to the discussion of the temple, and we'll also finish up with Solomon and get into the Rehoboam thing, for the kingdom. But are there any questions? It's 12 o'clock. I need to give you my office. Before you do, are there any questions that you need to ask? All right. Assuming that that means no. All right.
Okay, so I guess Steve was so good, he just